and I'll start with myself. I wanted to ask Dr. Cole, you explained the difference between the hazard analysis and critical control points, or HACCP, and good manufacturing processes, but I'm not sure I understand how that relates to many of the bills that are now, you know, they're calling them preventive safety plans, which you flashed up in your chart, or preventive controls. Just describe to me a little better maybe the differences between the HACCP and many of the bills, the language in the bills, preventive safety plans or preventive controls, if you could, a little better. I know you flashed one of those up, but I don't necessarily understand the difference. I understand that the GMPs are like the basic fundamentals, but
yeah, I think the best way to think about it is the term preventative food safety plan is a broad term which could include a whole range of different preventative measures. The way that those preventative measures could be implemented within industry and then inspected are things like GMP, which is the, as you said, are the basic kind of building blocks. You can't then go on, you can't do HACCP unless you've got the building blocks in place, unless you've got the basic sanitary conditions in place.
But then these preventative control systems can vary widely. So if that's the case, is it sufficient to just require that all manufacturers or producers simply have a food safety plan in place? Or do we have to, if there has to be a need for FDA to have ability to be more specific than that?
I think the trick there is to, because even with the additional resources, there's always going to be finite kind of resources we can bring to bear on a public health burden. So we have to be smart about the way that we apply these tools. And so we have to use either GMP or HACCP or both appropriately to the hazard that we're trying to control and the risk that we're trying to manage. So, you know, so if we take let's take a fresh produce example. I think the comments from one of the testimonies here relating the products, it's product specific. If we were to look at the safety of potatoes, okay, potatoes usually end up being cooked and prepared, and we're not really that concerned about the safety of potatoes.
So it's going to vary from product to product.
It's going to vary depending on the level of risk that we're trying to control. Yeah.
Now let me go to Mr. Wall then. I mean, you can comment on this as well, but if there was a system of mandatory preventive controls in place prior to the peanut butter, to the PCA outbreak, would that have helped to prevent it from ever occurring in the first place? And if you want to comment on what Dr. Cole mentioned.
Well, thank you. And I do agree with Dr. Cole that the preventive control plan covers your underlying GMPs, sanitation plans, as well as your HACCP plan if you have one, and your testing. The key element for the PCA recall and outbreak is that the company, because of the absence of a plan and the records to support that plan, they weren't compelled during the inspections to actually show what they knew to the inspectors, which meant that when Georgia, the state of Georgia, went in and did inspections, they were just doing a spot check. Conditions on that day were what they could inspect. If a bill passes that contains this kind of requirement, when an inspector arrives, they will not only get to inspect the plant and the products that are there, they'll be able to go back and look through the records. And hopefully in that case, they would have found and acted on the positive salmonella test result findings the PCA had.
Because they basically have a plan in place about what they have to check for, is what you're saying.
That's right. It gives the inspectors the access to the information on food safety that the plant itself maintains, which today FDA doesn't have it and the states don't have it.
Well, just give me a little more, maybe Mr. Stenzel, talk about how a plan might be different, like tomatoes versus spinach, and are there certain things that you'd require for both? Versus things that would be different?
There are. You're seeing the full chain here in this panel discussion. We actually start at the farm level with good agricultural practices, which are kind of the GMPs of the farm level, I might say. That's the basics that all farms should be following. There are also then commodity-specific standards and practices that we believe are appropriate. We've called for FDA to implement, particularly for those products that have been associated with a pathogen in the past, even rarely. So for tomatoes, there would be different sets of standards and practices, commodity-specific guidelines. Today that exists. The industry's worked hard in different sectors. The tomato industry, the leafy greens, in fact, have done a pretty good job. But we need FDA to be the holder of that standard so that it's applied across the industry and it's not left just to individuals to follow it on our own.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Deal?
I think there seems to be general agreement that a food safety plan needs to be in place, and they will vary depending on what level of production you're in. Mr. Lugg, though, if we do make these plans mandatory and FDA comes in to inspect, in your opinion, what records should be disclosed to the FDA inspector in terms of those safety plans?
What we would really like to have happen is when the plans are being developed, we would like to have FDA input along with our own so that the plan has all of the steps that the FDA would like to see included in it so that when the inspector arrives, he's been a part of that architecture and he can easily see what he wants to see.
So he would, by having access to the plan, know what they have done from a preventive standpoint.
Exactly. I think that the owner of the firm needs to own the food safety plan, but certainly there are very good advisors within CIFSTAN, for example, that can assist in making that plan even better.
Let's go to the next step on this in a logical sequence, and any of you that would like to respond, please do so. The next logical step is what do you do with regard to laboratory testing? Now, I would imagine that many firms have internal labs that do internal testing, and they would, of course, I presume, maintain records of their own internal testing. Others would rely on external labs to provide testing and test results back for them. The one big question that I still have is, to what extent do we require those lab tests to be disclosed to FDA? And the reason I have some concern about it is that you may have tests being done for a variety of different reasons. One might be someone who is going to process a product, but they want to find out what the status of the raw product is. Let's say peanuts, for example. In its raw stage, they may get a result that it may be have some salmonella contamination. But if they're intending to follow through with the kill cycle, then obviously that should eliminate that particular problem. My concern is that I don't think we ought to necessarily overburden FDA with every lab report given under every circumstance and for every purpose. So how do we differentiate what lab reports should be disclosed, and do you have any thoughts on that?
I'll take a shot at that if I may. The FDA's concern is that if you require these lab tests to be routinely submitted, people may just stop doing them.
That's right.
Firms often do them as part of their quality control process at the end to make sure that their systems are working. I think the state of Georgia was considering legislation that would require notification. But again, the fear is if you require it and the firms just stop doing the lab testing, you've not improved things.
Right.
But it would be important if FDA finds a connected problem, say in a PCA example, is in there an inspection and says to them, do you have any laboratory findings that would help us understand if you're the source of the problem? And if they say yes, then of course FDA should be able to access those records.
So you're saying then that should be a part of the maintained records subject to inspection when the FDA inspector comes in, not that the lab, upon receiving a negative or positive, as the case may be, report, that the lab has to directly report at that point to FDA. You're saying...
I understand that that's the FDA position, yes.
Okay, all right. Anybody else want to comment on that? Mr. Wall.
Thank you. I just want to note that today, most of the bills that you're looking at do have some lab reporting, but the different bills are different in their strengths. And we really want to get, first of all, this access that Mr. Hubbard is talking about. Any time an inspection is done, the inspector should be able to see the full range of what the plant's looking at. But there are times, for example, where if testing is compulsory for an industry, or where there is some kind of public health alert, that you might want to compel some kind of reporting to the agency. So I think you need to leave the door open in some of those circumstances for testing, direct reporting, but the reporting really should go from the plant to the agency, not necessarily from the lab.
Dr. Cole.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good answer. Again, it comes back to based on risk. So if we're looking at the testing results as part of an ongoing food safety plan, I think the agency should have access to those records as part of that. They should have access to what follow-up actions were taken as a result of those results. And then for certain products, you might want to make it compulsory that a positive salmonella, for example, is a notified situation. If I'm making infant formula, for example, and I get a positive salmonella, that should be a notifiable instance, and I should be able to, that should go directly to the agency. So again, unfortunately, the devil's in the detail with the risk, managing the risk versus the resources.
Just a quick comment. That's where we need your help in fleshing out the devil, because we can get the broad principles. I think it's the fleshing out of that, and I would appreciate hearing from you if you have any further thoughts about how we do that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Deal. Mr. Gonzalez is next.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. First question, and I need to get the pronunciation. Is it Ms. DeWall? Is that correct?
DeWall, that's correct.
Thank you. We have DeWalls in San Antonio that came from Minnesota, but they spell their name a little differently, but it is DeWall. Page 3 of your written testimony, the absence of federal inspection, inadequate state inspections led problems at PCA fester. No matter how much we, I guess, empower the FDA, it's just going to be overwhelming. We're never going to have all of the assets and resources truly because of just the expanse of the issues. And we're going to have to form partnerships, obviously, with state authorities and, of course, private enterprise. With the Peanut Corporation of America, my understanding is that they had an operation in Texas. You're probably very familiar. It may have been Georgia-based, but that peanut butter, a lot of it, obviously, out of the state of Texas.
Virginia-based.
Oh, is it Virginia-based? Well, well, then we're a subsidiary and happy to have been a subsidiary only. But the question comes down to is that they did have private testing. And I'm just wondering, I don't know what we have out there now as far as certification of the labs that are actually hired. The question always is that the closeness of the relationship generally will lead to whatever conclusion the person that's requesting the testing. Do you have concerns regarding that particular aspect going forward?
Yes, I think it's critically important that the legislation should contain a lab accreditation provision. Now, that won't apply to every in-house lab that a company may have, but lab accreditation will raise the confidence that both inspectors at the state level, federal level can have in the results of those tests. But getting to your question on the complexity and how will FDA actually manage its job. I mean, they have a huge job of regulating this, both the domestic industry and imports. And the reality is the agency has been starved for resources. There are certainly management structures that could work. That would allow for FDA to have very consistent programs working with the states to do inspection. But I don't believe those programs have been designed at the agency. And unfortunately, the public's really losing confidence in the ability of this agency to do those tasks. So it is important to get the funding in place, to get the new legislation and these new authorities in place where there is common agreement on so much of this. But we also, I'm not sure that even with those elements, we're going to be able to restore consumer confidence in the functioning of this agency. So I was very glad today to hear Chairman Waxman say that the question of structure, which was also raised by Representative Eshoo, would be one that they would leave open for further consideration, because it is very important that consumers trust the agency to manage this huge responsibility.
And I think the authors of the bills recognize that, and we're going to be moving forward, and hopefully we'll do as complete a job as possible under the circumstances and the competing bills. The other end, this is going to be to Mr. Stencil, Mr. Lugg, and that is what really establishes accountability. In my view, it's liability. Not that this may have an application. One concern I have is that the FDA is, in essence, not just the floor of the standard of care, but represents the standard, which we all agree today is totally inadequate in form and in practice, and yet many people will look to that as what would govern the behavior of individuals out there in this particular chain, as we say, from the farm to the retailer. You all have any views on the liability of individuals out there and how important that aspect in this whole, what I say, the accountability established by liability?
Mr. Gonzalez, you raised an important point. I think the chairman mentioned it in the beginning. It is the responsibility of food companies and food purveyors to ensure that we have safe foods. It's government's responsibility, we believe, to make sure that there is a system of oversight and integrity and set the standards that we have to comply with. But ultimately, that liability on the individual food company is a pretty darn important motivator. Look at PCA, for the example of when you do something wrong. I think they were called a rogue operator, Mr. Deal. Look at what that penalty is going to be. I'd also like to answer or comment on your earlier question, if I may, about partnerships, particularly on farm. This is very important. We don't anticipate a reality of FDA hiring 3,000 inspectors to go across farms in the United States or abroad. The partnership there we would recommend is with USDA, who knows agriculture in the United States, knows it abroad as well, in partnership with state departments of agriculture. FDA needs to set the public health standard. That's for the integrity and the confidence. But then in terms of actual outreach, education, auditing on farm, a strong partnership with agriculture would make sense.
And Ms. Lugg, I apologize, but my time is up. And I yield back to the chairman.
Thank you. The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to start with Mr. Lugg. And I like that the comments that were just addressed by my colleague from Texas. I understand that the heavy hand of the liability process will also punish the bad actors, and it is in the best interest of everyone to have a safe and efficient operation. Mr. Lugg, is it safe to say that sometimes the inspections conducted by you all are maybe more specific than you might get from an FDA inspection?
Yes, our inspections, particularly with respect to good agricultural practices in the field, are very detailed.
Can you give us an example?
Sure.
Of something that you may have spotted that FDA may not have?
Yes. In the agricultural production sector, which the FDA really doesn't spend a lot of time with, we have our own staff that will go and select the piece of ground that we're going to plant on, and that piece of ground is chosen based on the environment that surrounds it and the quality of the water that we can use to irrigate with. That's something that the FDA wouldn't normally be concerned with. Now, we have a new group in California called the Leafy Greens Marketing Agreement, and they do get concerned with the good agricultural practices. But our folks, the FDA folks, generally come into our manufacturing facilities.
And I think that's, Mr. Stenzel, I think that's kind of your point you were making as far as having USDA deal kind of with the agricultural end of this process. I think a lot of us, depending upon the, what your life experiences are, I used to be in the active military, and we feared the Inspector General coming down, and the Inspector General would have we knew the list, right? We knew the standards. And by golly, by knowing they were coming down, it made us clean up. Really, we want to be careful. I mean, we really want to go after the bad actors. I mean, we want to go after the people who would take a report, falsify the records, inspect them, and nail them, versus those who have a proven track record of having, I think you testified once before, or when we were doing the oversight investigation, if you talk about leafy greens, and if the processing facility has irradiation, and salmonella you may want to inspect to make sure that the irradiation machine is working, but if that's killing salmonella, then you have addressed that need versus maybe the multitude of other things that you might have to do. I want, Mr. Wall, I've talked about this because I've been I really want to focus, and I talked about the risk-based approach, and that talked about the food safety plan, but then identifying for particular crops. I mean, I think you can have a generic system, but you do have to identify for the specific crop. But what about the debate of the inspection regime? If you have a successful manufacturing facility, has good manufacturing process, has a food safety plan, has historically been graded at 100% A+, super duper 5-star quality, do you think it's a good use of our resources to be in there twice a year versus my issue is, man, if they're a good actor, we ought to incentivize them. And we ought to take the time for the second investigation and go after the bad actors. Could you comment on that?
Certainly. The question of trying to create a risk-based inspection system, but one that also gives the agency the flexibility to identify the best performers and spend less time and less resource there is one that we've really spent a lot of time looking at. I wish we were dealing with legislation that required 6-month inspections. Most of the bills actually are looking at, maybe 1 year, maybe 2 years, maybe 4 years, depending on the type of facility. So there's a broad range of inspection. But there is one bill that actually provides strict inspection, a risk-based inspection system, but then gives a lot of flexibility to FDA to set alternative inspection frequencies when plants show that they deserve it. And that type of language is contained in Representative DeLauro's bill, the Food Safety Modernization Act. So the bills range from very general language also to very specific language. Her bill has more frequent inspection frequencies, and maybe I don't know how the committee would feel about the affordability of some of the inspection frequencies in the bill, but it's a very good model to look at because it really defines what is risk-based inspection for the agency and sets and then sets these alternative inspection frequencies based on criteria.
Thank you. Ms. Christensen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank the panelists for their testimonies and in particular for their recommendations. Some of you have recommended a separate agency, and I'll ask, anyone can answer or all can answer. Do you think, for those who think we should have a separate agency or for those who don't, do you think that it would be just as effective to have just a specific office under FDA with a single head? Would that equate well enough for you?
I think I'll start this answer, though you're all welcome to join in. We have looked at the question of a single agency ranging from a unified agency with all of meat and poultry inspection combined with all of FDA inspection to one that's more narrow. The approach that we're looking at right now is one which just separates out the food functions at FDA under a separate food standards administration, similar to what they've done in many European countries and in other developed countries around the world. The Food Standards Agency would be headed by a food safety expert, and we don't have that in place today at FDA. There is no line authority for food safety. The policy issues are handled at CFSAN, the Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition. The inspection force is managed by the Office of Regulatory Affairs. The budget comes out of the Commissioner's office. There's really no line authority here. And really there's no risk communicator when something bad happens. I mean, who's going to be on the call? Right now we hear from CFSAN, we hear from ORA and CDC. So I think there is a structural problem that needs to be addressed at FDA. It's possible that you could have a deputy commissioner for food issues, for example, that might play that role. But it's very important to us that you have someone with direct line authority to the Secretary of Agriculture. Just looking at the sister food safety agency for a moment, at the U.S. Department of Agriculture, they did about 10 years ago pass a law that required food safety to be headed by an undersecretary of food safety, and that person does have direct line authority to the Secretary of Agriculture. So our concern about some kind of deputy commissioner model is that you would still have everything going through the commissioner, who has just an incredibly large job for consumer protection today.
I'll give it a shot too. I've spent some time over the years thinking about that. It may be necessary to do that at some point, but if we could wave a magic wand right now and create that single food agency, tomorrow nothing would be any different, because you'd still have a under-resourced, under-authorized agency that couldn't solve these problems. So I think you're doing it the right way, which is fix the underlying problem, then go back and see if the structure can work with that and be effective. And if it's not, then I think the next step would be to look at a single agency.
Anyone else?
If I may, I think I'm going to agree with Caroline on this, that I do think that there's a fundamental problem in the lack of direct food authority within the agency at this point. So I would urge you to think about at least that narrow issue in the current food safety legislation. Whether it's the equivalent of undersecretary of FSIS at USDA, I think is a good one. We've got to untangle food authority from everything else within FDA.
Thank you. I came from the Committee on Homeland Security, and of course there as well, food security is also a major concern. And the way the system is today, I don't have any degree of comfort that if a terrorist wanted to do something to our food system, that they would have any problem. I was noting that then Secretary Tommy Thompson had raised that concern, and he remarked that he couldn't understand why terrorists had not yet attacked our food supply, because it was so easy to do. But your recommendations talk about preventing contamination at the production, at the storage and transportation lines. Do you feel that the recommendations that you're giving us around the food safety system now are adequate also for protecting from an attack, either from a homegrown or outside terrorist?
Well, the principles are the same, because you would analyze the risk and how easy it would be, say, to introduce a microbial agent into food and then have it, be shipped around to a lot of different places and injure a lot of different people. So you still would be looking at, well, how accessible is my facility? It might be as simple as making sure there's a security guard every night and the doors are locked. And of course, in other areas, it might need to be more sophisticated than that.
Who's next? Mr. Gingrey?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A couple of weeks ago, when we were having a hearing about the salmonella outbreak, unfortunately from the processing plant in my home state of Georgia, down in southwest Georgia, the testimony told us that the labs, these private labs that the processing plant contracted with to check for salmonella, apparently there were several positive results and then finally one negative, and you know the rest of that story. But the question I want to ask of the entire panel is what came up during that hearing. The fact that the labs were not required, maybe even prohibited, as I understood it, from sending that positive information to anybody else except from whence it came, from who they were contracted with to do the laboratory testing. And it just seemed to me that it would be fairly easy to get that information to the FDA. Computers or allow us to do that. I would like to ask the entire panel, in fact, what your thoughts are in regard to these positive results from these private labs actually being required to submit those to the FDA. And we'll start from my left, your right.
Thank you. The fact situation that was outlined in that committee hearing was just tragic. And I think the committee did a tremendous service to get those facts out. The mandatory requirement for labs to report it looks like an appealing solution because they're the ones doing the tests. But we have real concerns that if you don't couple any mandatory testing reporting with a requirement to test, then the result will be, as Mr. Hubbard said, that companies just won't test. So you need to have in the legislation the ability for FDA to say, for peanut processors, you might have to test for this pathogen or that indicator organism, and then determine when those test results would be appropriate. I do think that there are some pathogens, botulism is an example, where mandatory reporting by a lab might be appropriate. But I think that the legislation should be clear that FDA has the authority to require companies to test. They should be able to check their test records when they inspect the plants, and that means anybody, the Agriculture Department of Georgia or the FDA, and then on certain pathogen combinations that, in fact, it would be open to mandatory testing either by the plant or by the lab.
Mr. Deal touched upon that earlier. Certainly it would be important if FDA went to a facility like PCA and was doing an inspection and identified PCA as a source of a problem, that they should be able to say as part of their inspection process, have you done any lab testing? And if the answer is yes, can we see that? And so we can see what you knew and when you knew it. But to require all labs to automatically send information to the FDA could actually cause people to stop doing the testing, which would not be an outcome that I think most people would want. So I think Ms. DeWall sort of parsed the difference in that.
But as Ms. DeWall said, FDA certainly could require, in certain commodities, in certain steps in the process, that the testing be done for particular pathogens, and that could be a requirement.
And that might be necessary in some cases, that's right.
Yeah, I would agree with those comments. I think this is a situation where, given, this is not the first outbreak we've had with peanut butter. We had one 2 years ago. There have been outbreaks overseas. I think we should be viewing this product as a high-risk product. We should have a requirement to test and a requirement to report those tests. I think also we need to have preventative controls in place to prevent contamination. Once salmonella is in that product, it's very resistant, okay, to heat processing, etc. So we need suppliers or companies buying that product too should have, really done a better job in supplier assurance of that product rather than just looking at test results as well. So.
I think we share a pretty common view on the panel, particularly that access to those test records is the most critical aspect. I share the same concern in terms of required every single test to be automatically forwarded to FDA. That I'm not sure that that's the most effective answer for a company that deliberately retested and retested until they found something they wanted. That's criminal behavior, and no matter what standard we would put in place, I'm not sure we're going to prevent someone who does that. They would not send the results.
Yeah, agreed. In that situation, it wouldn't have made any difference.
But
Mr.
the
Lugg,
access to the records, I think, is absolutely critical.
Thank you, Mr. Timpson. Mr. Lugg?
Your
microphone is not on.
I'm sorry. Because we're in the fresh business and the difficulty we have in collecting a representative sample, we rely so heavily on prevention that we just don't have a lot of lab results from our agricultural fields. We do have a program of what we call intelligent testing, and we do share those results routinely with researchers and our California Department of Public Health. As far as a requirement to furnish test results, I think that might discourage people from actually getting tests done and might in the end result in not the result that you'd like.
We have to move on. Mr. Waxman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to elaborate on some of the points Mr. Gonzalez raised. We've learned at numerous hearings the foods program at FDA has been starved for resources over the years, and Mr. Hubbard, in your testimony, you state there are currently 150,000 registered facilities in the U.S., and the chart you provided us today on the plummeting numbers of inspections in the U.S. paint a stark picture of the effects of this loss of resources, and that's had a real impact on food safety. But the problem doesn't stop there. We're all acutely aware of the fact that we now have an increasingly globalized food market. We import foods from all over the world. There are apparently more than 200,000 registered foreign food facilities. How much does each inspection cost? Do you have any kind of estimate you can give us?
A domestic inspection, a HACCP inspection can be around $3,000, and a regular sanitation GMP inspection can be around $2,000, so they're not cheap.
Well, if we're talking about having FDA inspect over 360,000 facilities with some regularity, that's an overwhelming task in terms of the workload, and it will obviously cost a great deal. I've heard many suggest that the answer is to extend FDA's workforce by supplementing it with private inspectors working on behalf of FDA. But I want to raise some concerns about that. There was a recent article in the New York Times that raised problems with these private inspectors. They say that food company being inspected often hires and pays for its own private inspector, creating a glaring conflict of interest. How those private inspectors frequently did not catch the problems at plants whose products later sickened consumers, and some of those companies who later were found to have contaminated products were even given excellent or superior ratings. That was the case with both PCA peanut outbreak and with the children's snack Veggie Booty in 2007. So in some ways, I'm even more concerned about the notion of relying on private inspectors in foreign countries. Obviously, the primary reason domestic companies want to import from other countries is that these products are less expensive. And the reason they're less expensive is usually that they are not produced under strong food safety protection. So relying on third parties in those countries raises some serious questions. My fundamental concern with a third-party system for imported foods governed by FDA is that it still puts a huge burden and responsibility on FDA. I think that a company benefiting from the importation of cheaper products and ingredients should have a duty to check up on these foreign companies and be held accountable when there are failures. Indeed, some companies are already doing very thorough inspections of their foreign suppliers on their own. Do you agree that a company should have a responsibility to check on its own suppliers And if we're forced to rely on third-party private inspectors, what sort of protections do you think can be put into place to address some of these concerns?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, you've touched upon a very important issue. It may be your single hardest policy choice in this debate, because you're absolutely right. The third-party system has not proven itself to be working properly now. It clearly is not working. FDA does believe that there are ways of beefing up that system with you.
Don't pay attention.
With prohibitions against conflict of interest, with better training, with FDA audits behind them. The fundamental dilemma is you can never have enough inspectors to go to 316,000 facilities, FDA inspectors. But on the other hand, these third-party folks need to be under a very serious regimen of oversight. And I do think that your question about having the importers, the U.S. importer, bear more responsibility for the quality of the product they're buying from, say, China, is an important piece of it. And in fact, the major food companies are beginning to acknowledge that they need to do that they need to know who they're buying from and what their quality is. And if they don't know that, they should not be buying from that foreign firm.
Thank you.
You want to add anything to that?
I do. The concept you've laid out in terms of having the company take more responsibility works well when you're dealing with ingredients. But, sir, it doesn't work so well when you're dealing with whole foods. There are a lot of foods that come in a port of entry and go directly into retail. And who's going to be that importer of record becomes a real issue, because it's defined today in regulations, but it's really it could give rise to some fly-by-night situations.
Well, we've got to look at these concepts carefully, and because we can't afford all the inspectors that we think we're going to need, and I don't know that we can rely on all those third-party inspectors either to feel that we're being protected. I see my time has expired, and other members are waiting for their turn, so I'll yield back the time I've overdone.
Thank you, Chairman Waxman. I'm going to ask Mr. Sarbanes to ask questions, and then that'll be it before the votes. We have 3 votes, 15, a 5, and a 5. So we'll ask you to stay so we continue with questions. So we'll do Mr. Sarbanes, and then we'll come back for the rest of the members.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for your testimony. I was particularly interested in the discussion about consumer confidence and how difficult it is going to be to restore consumer confidence. And I take it that if I'm hearing the discussion properly, even with the best food safety regime in place, there's still going to be outbreaks, right? So if you linked your bid to boost consumer confidence to the notion that you would prevent outbreaks, that's sort of a dead-end aspiration. So it really comes down, I would imagine, the thing that's going to bolster consumer confidence the most effectively, is a rapid response when there is, because that's the high-profile incidents, right, that occur. Otherwise, it's like oxygen. You're not going to notice it, right, if things are working well. So it's when there's an outbreak that you have a rapid response, that you have the traceability opportunities and so forth, and you show the public that you can quickly isolate it, you know, within hours, within days, whatever is feasible to do with a good safety regime. And then they come away from the experience saying, you know, the cops on the beat, this is being handled, and, you know, we're protected. And I would just like to get your reaction to that. And maybe there's other leverage points to help with this consumer confidence question, but it seems to me that's probably one of the most obvious, first of all.
Thank you. You're right that we're always going to have outbreaks. The issue is how many and how big are they. The bills that you're considering address both ends. If we can prevent the problems from occurring, then the number of outbreaks will be reduced. If we can increase the traceability, the ability to find the contaminated product, then we're going to reduce the size of those outbreaks. So I think there are components that address both of those issues, but I think they're both essential.
Any other comments? Yeah.
I would like to make the point, Mr. Sarbanes, for most of my career at the FDA, Roper and Washington Post and Harris polls showed FDA with the second highest consumer confidence in the entire, among all civilian agencies next to the National Park Service. But since 2000, that has reversed. Mm-hmm. It used to be around 70% confidence level. Now it's around 30%. That's a tremendous reversal that I think reflects the kind of concern you're talking about, because when FDA can't find the source of these things quickly and then stamp them out, get the food out of the commerce, then I think that the public just feels their government's not serving them well. So the speed at which outbreaks can be responded to and stopped is absolutely important. But that will require more than FDA. You have the right. CDC component, and then the state health departments are a big piece of that.
Let me ask a question about the deterrent effect, because you all have alluded to this, and I'm just curious now where the number of inspections relative to the number of facilities and so forth is so low. I mean, is there an operative deterrent effect at the current time, or not really?
I actually tracked that a few years back. As the inspections went down, the recalls went up, and the adverse findings from the FDA inspections that did get done went up. Mm-hmm. So in other words, as the inspectors disappeared, the vigilance in the firms disappeared with them.
Right.
So I think the fact that they think FDA might come helps, and the fact that they know FDA won't come now is clearly not helpful.
Well, and I imagine there's a sort of tipping point that you have to get past to create an effective deterrent in this process. I have no further questions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. So we're going to break. We have 3 votes. Should be back in about half an hour, but we'll come right back and finish with the rest of the members. Committee stands in recess.